my friends, hope you are well. Today I'm challenging myself to make a diorama in a much smaller scale than I've ever done before, building a nice little scene for these tiny 10mm warriors. Let's do it.
Swamp Rip Miniatures.
I bought a whole bunch of these guys off eBay a while ago. There were probably like 500 of them in this massive bundle, and after some thorough internet sleuthing, I'm pretty sure these are made by Pendraken or Pendraken or Pendrachen or whatever. And since they're so small, I got to thinking about how cool it would be to make a diorama with them and have a massive battle kicking off inside a tiny little area. I'd be able to fit hundreds of these guys into the kind of space you'd struggle to fit 20 or so of your typical Space Marine sized minis. So I sifted through them and I've picked out a bunch of Vikings I'm going to be painting up today, with my first step being to attach them all to some lollipop sticks with the help of some blue tack. I've painted some of these minis already, and I found this method of lining them up for painting was the easiest outside of actually gluing them down onto a base, which would not work for these dioraming purposes obviously, and I'm using blue tack, but you could equally use double-sided tape or that sticky stuff between your toes, whatever you want. I then got them primed up using a primer I assumed was grey because the can is grey, but it was actually white, so oh well. Either way, our Viking warband was now ready for a splash of paint. In total, we've got 79 of these tiny little Vikings to paint up today, and I'm a bit annoyed I didn't count them beforehand because I would have just chucked one more into the mix and left it at an even 80, because knowing that I'm painting up a weird uneven number of 79 is making me quite uncomfortable, but I couldn't possibly prime up one more of these, so I will swallow my discomfort with the same grace of a seagull swallowing that bit of leftover double cheeseburger you throw to it in the McDonald's car park. Since these guys are so small, we're not going to be able to get the same level of detailed finish you would with your larger scale minis. I think with tiny little guys like this, the key is contrast. So we're not spending ages trying to pick out little microscopic facial features or belt buckles and stuff like that because I probably have a brain aneurysm. We're just going to try and create a sense of contrast so the minis have a bit of visual interest from a short distance. And I'm not necessarily going for historical accuracy here by any means, but the dyes and materials available for their clothing at the time would be fairly limited, and they'd probably be found wearing more neutral kind of washed out colors for their tunics and whatnot, so I'm using these more muted colors to paint in the tiny little items of clothing, and then I'll pump up that contrast by using a variety of bolder colors for their shields. I thought this would be the best way for creating a colourful and varied Viking force that is at least somewhat based in reality, as the shields Vikings used would have really different designs determined by their status, their favourite Pokemon, the clan they belong to, or just whatever looked cool to them at the time. And I don't know if any of that is actually true because I'm basing all my Viking knowledge on the TV show Vikings, but feel free to spread this information as absolute fact because you just saw it on YouTube. I was having a lot of fun painting these shields, to be fair. They were way more enjoyable than the little carpal tunnel inducing faces and weapons I painted earlier, and there was no particular rhyme or reason for the ones I was painting. I was just slapping on random little designs I thought looked kind of Viking-y and trying to get as many different colours going on to pump up that level of contrast and visual interest, which would give your juicy little eyeballs more things to explore once they were added to the diorama. Anyway, here's our little finished Viking warband, Ragnar and the boys coming to pillage a village near you, and some of the painting was a little bit skew to be honest. As you can imagine, these can be a bit annoying to paint because they're so tiny, and I'm not the best painter anyway, so we're probably lucky they came out this good. But yeah, these guys will now need an opposing force to go up against, and in true Blue Peter fashion, here's some I made earlier. This is a detachment of some fearsome Norman soldiers. I think they're Normans anyway. I'm like at least 80% sure they're Normans. But either way, we can just pretend they're Normans. How many times can we say the word Normans?
At least once more, Miss Swan.
Normans. For these guys, I've gone with a much more synchronized scheme than the Vikings, as I'd imagine they'd be much more uniformly equipped than our little ragtag Norsemen. So I've gone with a red color scheme for all the warriors, except for these little crossbowmen who are just wearing some plain old tunic things, and I've thrown in a bit of extra flavor with some different designs on the shields. Don't let this Danish flag deceive you, these are definitely Normans. It just looked like a cool design up here, flapping about like a bingo wing in the breeze. We've got 54 of these guys guys in total, meaning they're slightly outnumbered by the Vikings, which should result in a successful ambush for our Norsemen, and also means that we have 133 miniatures in total for our diorama, which is the most miniatures I've ever painted in the space of a few evenings, and part of the reason you're not seeing these little red men being painted, because I was too tired and grumpy to film any more painting stuff. But moving swiftly on, it's time to make the scenery for these guys to battle it out on. On one hand, I was feeling slightly nervous about making the scenery actually, because I've never made anything in this scale before and wasn't sure if my kind of usual techniques would transfer to a smaller scale, but equally I was really excited to try them out and see what we could come up with, and it was a good opportunity to learn some new skills. So I got to work making the rough shapes first with some old polystyrene, adding a larger hilly area on the right from which our Vikings would launch their ambush, and a smaller section on the left from which our Viking commanders will watch over the battle. I also left a gap in the middle here as I had an idea about a little shallow stream running through the center of the piece, and then I got to work adding some rock faces. Usually I'd use plaster rocks for this, but I thought I might struggle with getting the finer texture I wanted today, so I decided to try out some cork sheeting instead, and I basically just ripped off little strips of this stuff, roughed up the edges using my fingernails to give a craggier and more natural appearance, and then layered them up like an onion or an ogre or something like that.
Layers!
I stacked the cork strips up around both our hilly areas to create a larger and a smaller rock face, and I was pretty happy with how they look so far. They should look a lot better when painted obviously, but I'm seeing some good potential here. So I sealed them in with a mixture of paint and PVA glue, which was pointless because I covered the entire diorama with paint and PVA glue in a minute anyway, but I feel like no project is truly complete until I've done at least one completely pointless and time wasting task, so it was good to get that in early. Next up, I added a quick bit of wall filler around the sides where the exposed polystyrene was sticking through, just to cover up that horrible bubbly texture, and then I covered the entire diorama with my homemade mud mixture, give it all some extra earthy texture and added durability as always. I used the brush to form a quite subtle channel in the mud here, which will hold my little stream later on. Then before the mud had dried off, I sprinkled some leftover chunks of cork around the bases of the rock faces to look like some larger chunks that had fallen off, a whole bunch of this basing mixture around the sides of the stream to build up a kind of rocky riverbed, and a little bit more of it to blend in my big chunks of cork. So everything is looking pretty bonkers at this point, you know. We've got a bunch of different colors going on and everything looks weird and ugly, and I was definitely hating the appearance at this stage. But as always, once I used a mixture of PVA and paint to seal everything in and act as a bit of an undercoat, the individual components came together a lot more and I could see what direction this was all going in. Painting the scenery was the next job on my list, and I'd been feeling really excited about this as rock faces are definitely one of my favourite things to paint, and it's been a while since I've done any actually. I made my usual start with some greys and browns for the base coats on the rocks in the ground, and then I began dry brushing with some lighter greys and a pale ochre colour to accentuate some of the rough and craggy textures from the cork and the rocky base and mixture on the edges of the stream. Then, to bring out those lovely natural stone colours on the rocky areas, I'm going with my tried and trusted technique of sloshing on a bunch of different coloured washes to add some nice coloured hues. I make these by just watering down some of your cheap old box standard craft paints, and usually go for black, brown, green and ochre being applied in that order. I find it helps to go from the darkest to the lightest colours here, as the darker ones add the impression of depth and shadow in the recessed areas, while the lighter colours sit on top of those and act a bit more like natural surface flora. But whatever way you want to do it, just make sure you dab off the excess with some tissue and allow the washes to dry thoroughly between each coat so they don't just blend together and look like a weird dirty mess. After that, we're left with some much more natural looking rockery with some nice varied coloured hues that look way better than your plain old grey on grey rocks and give me a nice tingly feeling in my belly. Then all I do to finish these areas off is just come back in with those same lighter dry brushing colours from earlier and reinforce the highlights on the outer craggier sections for a bit more definition and a bit more contrast. Easy squeezy. The only other part I'm painting today is the stream bed, so I whip out my favourite swampy goo and I'm applying a thin layer of this, which I dry off with a hairdryer and then add a second layer to get some good coverage. This is just to add a really easy wet mossy look underneath for when I add my water effect later, and you probably would have seen me use this recently if you caught any of my Swamperial Guard videos, and if you haven't, then go and watch those because I will cry if you don't. With our painting done, it was now time to place down all the miniatures, which I'd been slightly dreading, as these boys stand on quite a chunky little base here, which would obviously stick out a lot if I just glued them down to the surface and chuck my flock on them, so I had to get quite creative and use this wooden stick to poke out a small indentation through the hardened mud surface that I could then slot and glue the base into, so the flock I'd be adding would sit nice and flush with the surface of the mud. And this process was really fun. Some of the holes would be too deep, and the miniature would be buried up to their chest like they're in quicksand, and sometimes the super glue I was using would reach the foam underneath and start melting, so I'd have to try and glue it to the edges of the mud instead, and I had like 130 of these to do, and blah 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 blah. Yeah, I won't lie, it kind of sucked, but there was a positive side to this also. These miniatures have really limited poses and they're not very dynamic really, so this was a good exercise in being creative and arranging minis in a way that implies a dynamic and moving scene while using quite basic and static sculpts. For example, I'd staggered some of the Vikings crossing the stream to imply they're struggling to wade through the water with all their gear, and added the ones charging down the hill with the front of their group expanding out from the narrow column to meet the enemy. The Normans at the front here are completely focused on the enemies ahead of them and unaware of what's going on to their flank. Some in the middle are beginning to notice and turn to meet them, whilst the rear portion are well aware of their impending doom and have gone spears down to meet the enemy. So yeah, I was pretty happy with how these were all placed in the end. I do think I've got an impression of movement going on, which is really cool, but let me know down below if you think I could have arranged these in a different way that looks even better. Now, my friends, it's time to finish this baby off and take it from a drab old boring battlefield to a battlefield that is green and looks cool. I don't know. Either way, I start by squirting out Daddy's special sauce all over the place. And then I throw down a whole bunch of this nice green flock. I'm using the finest one I have, as grass would barely have any visible height at this scale, and I also add a little bit of this onto the ledges and outcrops of the rock faces for a bit of extra pizzazz over there. I then take some more of that rocky basing mixture from earlier and chuck a bit of the finer stuff along the edges of the stream and the bottoms of the rock faces to add to the stony texture we've got going on there, and the diorama was instantly looking 10 times better after these steps alone. It's funny how much a little bit of greenery helps out. Next up, I whipped together a bunch of tiny trees using some very simple components, basically just some skewers, toothpicks, glue, and different colours of clump foliage I had laying around. And all I did was snap a section of the skewer off, glob on a bit of glue to the top of it, stick the foliage on, and then paint the trunk brown with a little bit of stippling for some added visual pleasure. To get a bit of variety going on here, I used different colours of flock, or used a skinnier toothpick instead of the thicker skewer, or used different shades of brown for the trunk. Keeping to the same basic recipe, but just tweaking the seasons ever so slightly to get a different tasting dish. I sort of layered these up with the larger trees being at the back and the smaller ones being placed towards the front to give more of a sense of depth and different levels to these areas. And when I'd started planting them down, I felt like the whole diorama just came together all of a sudden. The trees acted as a bit of a backdrop for the piece, kind of framing everything in, and also making the flanking Vikings make a bit more sense, as now they had the hiding place they needed to spring this surprise attack on the Normans instead of just appearing from thin air, which was cute. I also added little random clumps of foliage to act as bushes around the edges of the rock faces and down on the ground, and once everything was in place, I soaked in a bit more of that special sauce, which is just watered down PVA, or maybe it's ectoplasm, who knows, and then sprinkled on a bit more fine flock to add some more texture and variety to the trees. I gave the base of the diorama a quick touching in with some black, which also helped as everything was looking a bit bizarre sitting on a dirty white base until this point. And then my very last step was just to finally pour in the water for my stream. For this, I used some AK Interactive still water stuff, which I've only tried out a couple of times before, and I basically just squirt in a few drops, then tilt the diorama around until it flows into all the cracks and crevices, and repeat this with a second layer once the first is dried. You really don't need to add much of this stuff at once. This isn't like resin where you can have a kind of deep pour. You basically just want to add a couple of millimeters of this stuff per layer, then allow it to dry thoroughly, which takes like 24 hours or something mental like that. And anyway, that was all she wrote, my beautiful viewer. Let's take a look at the final piece and listen to some more of me rambling about stuff. So, all in all, I'm really happy with this diorama. There was loads of times throughout the project that I just really hated how it was all looking, and I wasn't sure if I'd even end up posting this because it didn't really seem to be going very well, but it all came together in the end, and adding the greenery and the trees seemed to be the thing that really sorted it all out. The trees especially are just a chef's kiss. In my opinion, I think they transformed the whole vibe of the diorama, and yeah, I just think they look awesome. I was a bit worried about using plain old skewers and toothpicks for the tree trunks, as they'd be dead straight and maybe not look so natural, but I think at this smaller scale it's not really an issue. I might try to add a bit more variation to this component in the future, but maybe not, to be honest, as they already look awesome. And after making these, I am itching to make more. I have been bitten by the tiny tree flea, so don't be surprised if you see another project involving these soon. One thing I will mention though is that I feel like it's missing a few little extra details that I would normally like to add to a diorama like this in a larger scale. Maybe the Normans could be dragging a kind of a wagon full of treasure or something like that, but I don't really have any quick go-to techniques for building stuff in this scale yet. While making this diorama, I had some ideas about tiny fortresses made from matchstick beams and a few other bits like that, but in terms of actual small details like fences or campfires or little tents or whatever it is, I've got a lot of learning and playing around to do still. I loved making a project in this tiny scale though. It was a first for me and probably a good first attempt overall, but I can see a lot more things being made in this scale in the future and a lot more experimentation being done before we have something I'm fully satisfied with. As always though, if you enjoyed this, then please subscribe or leave a like or a comment. Tell me which individual Viking was your favourite, or whether you think the Normans can overcome this ambush, or tell me what your favourite moment from The Lord of the Rings is and why it's Theoden's speech and the Rohirrim charge scene in Return of the King. For now though, I have been your friendly neighbourhood swamp rat, and I will see you very soon in another video. See ya.